Okay, so I think it is time for us to learn more about amphibians. So today we have our guest speaker, Laina Lockett, and she will be speaking to us all about amphibians. So Laina, are you ready? All right, there she is. So without further ado, everyone, please enjoy this talk by Laina.
Hello. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and I probably will unshare and reshare so that we can do some sound listening to some frogs. So let me just get that situated. All right, so thank you all for coming to a late night. I'm really excited to be able to talk with you all. Like Korea said, my name's Laina. I am finishing up my PhD in the next few weeks. And so the title of this talk, it's kind of funny, right? Foul and loathsome creatures, polluted habitats in New Jersey amphibians. So calling amphibians foul and loathsome. So why would I do that? So there's this guy named Linnaeus back in the day. He wrote that these foul and loathsome animals are abhorrent because of their cold body, pale color, cartilaginous skeleton, filthy skin, fierce aspect, calculating eye, offensive smell, harsh voice, squalid habitation, and terrible venom. All of those adjectives to describe frogs. But I don't know about you, but I actually kind of find them very intriguing and kind of cool to think about. And while they can have venom and they can look a bit odd at times, I think they're worth thinking about in a little bit more detail. And if you've never heard about Linnaeus, he's the one who's responsible for, all the weird names of all the different animals and plants that are in our environment. So he came up with the naming system. Anyway, I thought if we were going to talk about frogs, the first thing I should tell you about is what frogs and toads actually live in New Jersey, since that's where I'm going to assume a lot of you all are. It's where I am, it's where my research took place, it's where Rutgers is. So let's take a look. There are 18 different frogs and toads in New Jersey, so we'll start with toads. So I've arranged these into different families. And so we can call the first family true toads, and we have the fun Buffonidae is the name of the family. And there's actually two different toads in this group. So on the left, we have Fowler's toad, and on the right, we have the American toad. And at first glance, you might think, wow, these look very similar. But actually, if you lean in, you can actually see that there are warts in those dark patches on their back. And so American toads tend to have one, sometimes two warts in those dark circles, whereas Fowler's toads tend to have 3 or more warts in those dark patches. And so that's how you can determine which one you have caught, should you find one when you're out and about. Also, true toads, these Buffonidae toads, they have what we call bufotoxins. And so basically they are poisonous frogs, but they're not poisonous to us. But if you were another animal that thought that they looked like a nice tasty snack, you would quickly realize that they do not taste good because of that bufotoxin or that poison that they let out through their skin. So it is okay for you to touch or pick one up, but I would advise you to wash your hands after touching them. But honestly, I'd advise you to wash your hands after touching any amphibian. But they won't hurt you. As we learned in the trivia, they won't give you warts, although they have them themselves. Okay, so the next group of toads is the North American spadefoot. And so we only have one species in this family, and that's the Eastern spadefoot toad. And this type of frog is really cool because of their hind legs. They kind of have these claws that allow them to dig really well into the ground. And so toads are much more terrestrial. And so these toads actually spend most of the time underground. So they are very, very difficult to find because they really only come out like when it's raining, and then they go back to being underground. And so if you did see one, you'd probably see them digging what would look like backwards, right? Because they're digging their digging limbs, their legs are what's doing the work. And so they actually do it backwards. The next group is our tree frogs, and the family name for this is Hylidae. And so there's a lot of fun species in this group. So I'll talk about a few of them. So let's see. The green tree frog up in our right-hand corner is pretty interesting because it didn't used to be native in New Jersey, but with climate change, its range has expanded. So now we do find the green tree frog in New Jersey. If you're going down the road with your windows down, maybe a little later on this month, you will probably hear a lot of frogs. The frogs that you are most likely hearing is the northern spring peeper. They are very loud and they have these large choruses of singing that they do. In the bottom left-hand corner, we have two species I wanted to mention, or three species really. The first one is the Pine Barrens tree frog. So this one is pretty unique because they really like acidic habitats. So in kind of, I guess, central/southern New Jersey, we have the Pine Barrens. And so that's where this species lives because there's lots of bogs and like lots of acidic habitat for them to find there. The other species that I wanted to list or talk about were the northern gray tree frog and the Cope's gray tree frog. If you were to just have two of them next to each other, you wouldn't be able to visually tell the difference. So the difference between these two species actually is in their genetics. So the northern gray tree frog actually has twice as many chromosomes, and chromosomes are just, you know, where all of our DNA, our genetic information is held. So they have twice as much genetic information. And because of this, when they have their mating call, they make the same type of sound, but it's at a slower rate. So Cope's gray tree frog, it sings faster, it has half as many chromosomes, and it's actually endangered in the state of New Jersey. And I don't remember if I mentioned this, but the Pine Barrens tree frog is listed as threatened in New Jersey. So those are our two species that we want to make sure that we're really, you know, thinking about as far as conservation is concerned, at least in this state. And then our last group, is what we would call the true frogs. And this is the group, the ranids. This is the group that I spend most of my time studying. So I've done some work with pickerel frogs. So that's this guy in the bottom. I've done some work with tadpoles. We have green frogs, which are very, very common. Wood frogs, very common. Bullfrogs, bullfrogs are actually the largest frog in North America. And, you know, in our trivia, we saw that giant salamander that was 6 feet. So the bullfrog really only gets to be about 8 inches. So not nearly as large, but that is the largest species in this country. And then I'll talk about 2 more frogs in this group on another slide because this is the study species that I focused on. So these are all the frogs and toads that you would find in New Jersey. And so you might think, okay, why do we care about amphibians? Well, they are in decline more so than other categories of animals. So amphibians are declining at a much faster rate than mammals and birds and reptiles. And so that's why we want to think about them. Also, they can be indicators of what's a healthy habitat. So it's also good to know what's going on with amphibians for that reason. And so there are a lot of causes for why we're getting more and more extinct and threatened amphibian species. A lot of it has to do with habitat change, but the next most important thing is things like pesticides and other chemicals that we put into the environment. And so that's where we're going to kind of focus on for the remainder of the talk. And so the chemicals that I'm thinking about in particular, we would also call them nutrients. And so these are things that actually naturally occur in the environment at low levels. So if we think about nitrogen, we have ammonium and nitrate and nitrites. These are all different forms of nitrogen, and they are really important for different things that happen in the environment, like breakdown of dead organisms. We help get nitrogen into the soil so the plants can use it so they can grow. And then similar thing with phosphorus too, right? We have phosphate that naturally occurs in the environment. It gets into the, it's in our rocks and soil. And so that's all fine and good, but we also have influx of both nitrogen and phosphorus from different things like applying fertilizer to our farms. And right, so New Jersey has a lot of farmland, right? We're the garden state. So we do use a lot of fertilizer in this state. And then people like to use fertilizer for their gardens and their homes or to keep their lawn looking nice and beautiful. So we definitely have these in natural amounts and unnatural amounts in New Jersey. And so I just wanted to put up a few more pictures about nutrients. So the graph on the left-hand side, it shows basically this green line is showing how the population of humans has grown and really drastically increased in the last, several decades. But along with that, we see the use of fertilizer also increase very dramatically. So this blue represents the use of nitrogen fertilizer. And so you might think, well, fertilizer is good. It helps us get more food, and there are more people, so we need more food. Well, when we combine all of that extra nitrogen in with, increasingly warm temperatures, we get things happening that aren't so great. So there's this process called eutrophication, and the short end of it is it really means that the algae grow, right? Algae are plants, so just like our crops, they really like when we have all of this great fertilizer. But when there's a lot of algae and other plankton, then it reduces the amount of oxygen, and we see fish die in large amounts. And so this has really been happening since the 70s, and you can see this really kind of lines up with where we start seeing like this big, addition of nitrogen fertilizer in the environment. And so you might think, hey, fish dying, okay, that's not cool, but how does this have to do with frogs? Fair question. So what has been found is that when we have additional fertilizer, it can have a lot of effects on different types of environments. So for example, when there's higher amounts of nitrogen, we also get higher amounts of trematodes, which is a type of parasite. And so you'll see these really high infections and things like snails and even frogs. And when frogs have a lot of parasites, they tend to then start to have, developmental issues as well. So you have the nitrogen making the environment hard to breathe, right? And frogs breathe through their skin a lot of the time. So we have this difficulty in breathing, and then we have these infection rates that are going to cause additional limbs to grow. So there's a lot of different issues that can come with having these extra nutrients in the environment. And then there's also been research that has looked at some specific species of amphibians and shown that when you have more nitrogen or phosphate in the environment, it affects the number of frogs that you find. So there's a lot of frogs on this page. So I just wanted to kind of show you what this visually means. So if we have a lot of phosphate and nitrate in the environment, then we see a loss of the number of species, but also the diversity of the species. And so we call that diversity, that biodiversity, we refer to it as species richness. And then we also have the term species abundance. So in our population up here, the one I've labeled 1, there are 7 different frogs here. So it has a high abundance because there's a high number. Now, in our population 2, we have the same number, so the abundance is the same, but there's 3 different types of frogs going on here. So then we also have high species richness or high biodiversity. But then we can also have high species richness or high diversity, but also have low abundance, which means that although there are many types, there aren't many of each type. And so we see that when we have low levels of phosphate and nitrate, we have both high numbers and high diversity. Okay, so I promised you I would tell you a little bit more about the two leopard frogs that are found in New Jersey. And so this to me is what really got me interested in studying the frogs of New Jersey. So there was a Rutgers student who graduated right before I came. And as part of his research, he actually discovered the fact that there was another species of frog, which he named the Atlantic coast leopard frog. And so he found this when he was researching frogs on Staten Island. So we think of finding new species in places like the Amazon or places that are like very nice and warm and lots of rain. We don't think about finding new species in like an urban jungle, right? Where there's tons of people, lots of pollution, lots of trash, but that is exactly what happened. And so the reason it took so long, it took till 2014 for someone to realize that this was a different species, is because it looks very similar to the southern leopard frog. So you can see when they're held up next to each other, even though we know that they're different, they still are very similar. But you might notice that the Atlantic coast leopard frog, the snout is more rounded compared to the southern leopard frog. But if you actually, so you could, if you see them from the front, you might notice that. But the easiest way to me to determine the difference is to actually look at their hind legs. So this Atlantic coast leopard frog has a very dark coloration, and then it has like light spots, whereas the southern leopard frog is mostly light with dark spots on the hind leg. And so if you look at this map, you can see that the southern leopard frog is represented by this kind of pink color. And it turns out that they thought that what is purple used to be pink, but now we know that that purple represents the Atlantic coast leopard frog. So you can see how their range comes right up next to each other. And so that kind of contributed to difficulty in realizing that there was this new species of frog. And so also in this map, there's some areas that are grayed out. And so those are areas where they think that the Atlantic coast leopard frog used to live, but now it no longer is there. So localized extinction. So that's another really big reason why it's important to research this species, because we didn't know that it was unique originally. So we don't have a lot of information about it, but also we think it might be in decline. So we need to gather that information so we can conserve it. So I wanted to look to see if there really was an effect of nutrients on this species so that we could help try to find more population of it. So my question was, does ammonium, phosphate, and nitrate differ between locations where we find the Atlantic coast leopard frog and where we think it should be, but it isn't? And so I thought, like I read in those other studies, that in places where we find the frog, the amounts of nitrogen, phosphate, and ammonium would be lower than places where we don't find the frog. So how did I go about trying to answer this question? Well, I had to do a lot of field work. And so on the map are different sites that I visited in New York and New Jersey. And I went there looking for this species. Now, frogs are very hard to see, which you will maybe notice in the next few slides, but you can actually hear them when you can't see them. So I'd go, I'd listen, I'd collect water samples, and then I'd take those water samples back to the lab at Rutgers and analyze them to figure out how much of each nutrient was in each body of water that I visited. So let's see, so this is a trip that I took to Island Beach State Park. So we know that there's southern leopard frogs there, but we thought there might be Atlantic coast leopard frogs there as well. We went to some other places. So this is what I found, not a frog, but another amphibian at one of my sites in New York. This is Alamuchi, which is like northwestern New Jersey. Very beautiful. This site had other species of frog, but not the frog that I was looking for. So it's a lot of trial and error. We look for a lot of plants that are similar to try to find same conditions. And then we also would look for tadpoles to confirm the presence or absence if we didn't hear them in a location. And so we would drag, me and some of my undergraduate students would, look for these tadpoles. Sometimes we find them, sometimes we would catch frogs in our nets. And so that's kind of the process for finding these frogs. And so sometimes they are hard to see. I don't know if you all can tell, but there is actually a frog in this picture. Right here, you might see some spots that are on the leg, and you might see this line to outline the body and the top of their eyes and a little bit of their snout. So that's a wood frog hiding in the grass. But I'm going to stop sharing the presentation really quickly because I want to play for you. I want to play for you all what we were listening for. So I'm just going to reshare, but this time with sound. Let's see. So this is a professional recording that I'll play for you. And so you can kind of hear that. I mean, I would describe it kind of as a duck sound almost. That's how I kind of think about it. So that's what the professionals are able to, collect when they were out in the field. So it's very clear and crisp what you're listening for. I'm gonna try to play for you all a recording of what I was listening to, and there is an Atlantic coast leopard frog calling, but it's a little difficult to hear. So see if you can hear it. So I know this is a webinar, so I can't necessarily get feedback, but what I'm assuming you mostly heard was a very high pitched sound. So that was those spring peepers, but actually on, a different wavelength, like very low and quiet, you could hear that same kind of duck sound kind of more off in the distance. So the spring peepers, they were very close to where we were recording. They were in very high numbers, that high abundance that we talked about. And so our recording equipment, picked up on that really nicely, but it was a little hard to get recordings of the Atlantic coast leopard frog when we were out. But I do promise it was there, even if you didn't quite catch it. It's a little difficult to hear. So let's continue with the slideshow and see how things panned out. So I told you that the two chemicals that I was thinking about or nutrients were ammonium nitrate and phosphate. So we'll start with ammonia. So this is one of our nitrogen pollutants. And so I went out 3 different times. And so in all of the graphs, the dark colors are places that I visited that had the Atlantic coast leopard frog, and the ones that are white, which just an outline, are sites that I visited that didn't have the Atlantic coast leopard frog. And so looking at this, there's a lot of variation. But once I did some calculations, I realized that these really aren't different. So there wasn't any difference in the levels of ammonia. And so then I did the same thing for nitrate. And so same thing, places with and without. And even though this looks quite different, mathematically, they weren't considered to be different. So I was like, oh man, that's really disappointing, all this work, and doesn't seem to be any difference. Then I got to phosphate. And so you might think, well, this graph looks just like the rest of them, but it turns out that there actually was a difference in phosphate when it came to the second half of the year. So in mid-summer, it actually turned out that my hypothesis was correct. There were lower amounts of phosphate at places where we found the Atlantic coast leopard frog when compared to places where it wasn't found. And then in a strange turn of events, it was actually the opposite result when we went back in October. So in October, it actually had changed dramatically. So places where the frog was found were higher than the places where the frog wasn't found. So very interesting result, at least to me, some of what I thought and some of what I didn't think. And so what does all of this mean going forward? Well, I thought this this last visit was really interesting. So it turns out that frogs don't stay in the water all the time. So some species, right, we know some species do hibernate, and so they will actually leave the pond where they breed and hibernate somewhere else. So it's possible that they are leaving these sites. It's also possible that it's really more a fluctuation of the sites that they're not using that's driving the presence or absence, right? So because it went to be this high amount of phosphate, during the summer, even though it might have gotten to a place where they're okay with it, it's not consistently low phosphate. And so maybe that's why they don't use those particular wetlands or ponds or habitats. So they didn't have any real response to nitrate or ammonium. So it's possible also that this species just isn't as sensitive. So I told you that the bullfrog, right? If we go back, let's see, the bullfrog is really big. And it's also, not very sensitive at all. Same thing with green frogs. They are just found everywhere and they really don't care. And actually the southern leopard frog seems to be pretty hardy. We find that frog in a lot of places that we don't think it should like to be. So it's possible that, this group of frogs that we find in New Jersey, these ranids, are actually just, hardier frogs. And maybe something like the pine barrens tree frog, maybe if I were to have used that as my study species, maybe I would have gotten more dramatic results, for example. But basically, those are my main takeaways. And so I will end it there and see if you all have any questions. Okay, I see there are quite a few. Okay, so I can start at the top. So the first question I see is, how long is a frog's tongue? So you all made the craft with the frog tongue, and it actually turns out that frog tongues, although they seem long, really don't measure to be that long. So they're about 1/3 of the frog's body. So if a frog only grows to be 3 inches long, their tongue is really only 1 inch. But if we were to think about what that really means, like as far as a human, so I'm very close to 6 feet tall. So if my tongue was 1/3 of my height, my tongue would be 2 feet long. So, so it might not actually measure very long, but the ratio is actually quite impressive. Okay, I see that Philip would like to know if I have a favorite type of frog. So I would say I don't have a favorite type, but maybe a category. So I think that poison dart frogs are very cool, but there's actually multiple species that fall into that category. So they're very brightly colored because they are some of those frogs that take the toxin from their food. So poison dart frogs eat an ant that has a toxin in its body, and they've evolved to be able to eat those ants and not have the negative impacts. And I just think that just seems so cool. Plus, they're very pretty. Like some of them have, these beautiful blue lines and spots, and I don't know, I just think they're great. And I apologize if I mispronounce this name, but I think it's Sitara. Would like to know how many different types of frog species are in the world. So it's definitely over 5,000. Most of them are going to be found in, the warmer regions of the world. So if you think Central America, Brazil, some parts of, Asia, like Southeast Asia, places like that with very warm, wet climates is where you're going to find most of those species. So, New Jersey, it's not a tropical rainforest, so we only have 18. How did I know that I wanted to study frogs? I didn't actually. So when I was a college student, I was really interested in turtles. And I did my master's and I couldn't work with reptiles just because logistics. So I had to pick something else. And I picked actually what's called a water flea. So it's an aquatic bug. And that's what I studied. And that's where I learned about, man-made chemicals and how they impact the environment. I did some work with phosphate and some other pesticides and did research on that. And so then when I came to Rutgers, I got the opportunity to pick what I was going to learn or study and do research on. And so I wanted to do turtles, but then I realized that, turtles aren't that easy to study in the area that I'm in. So, that makes it really great if you are able to do it because there's not as much research out there. But for the time constraints of a PhD, I thought, I'm going to pick something that has a shorter lifespan. So that's how I decided on frogs because they still were aquatic, but they were just a little easier to work with. Philip would also like to know, how high can the average frog jump? Okay, so it depends on the frog, but they can jump, about 10 times their height. So if you were to think about that and how far could a human jump? So like I said, I'm very close to 6 feet. So that means that if I were to jump like a frog, I would be jumping 60 feet high. So that's pretty impressive, right? You think about basketball players and when they dunk, we're impressed by that. And that's not nearly as high as 60 feet, right? So Connie wants to know, are frogs social creatures? So I would say in the way that we think about like people being social and dolphins being social, I would say not so much. They do have some social interactions, right? Because they do, reproduce. And so to reproduce, the males have to, have some social interaction with the females. But otherwise, they do spend a lot of time independent, hibernating, looking for food. Sometimes different species will eat other species of frogs. So they tend to not try to stay around other frogs. So that way they don't become food for their neighbor, especially when they're tadpoles. Those bullfrog tadpoles will eat other tadpoles. Actually, funny story. So when I was an undergrad, I took a herpetology class. And so one night we went out to collect frogs. And so we caught all the different we were trying to find all the different frog species in Pennsylvania. And so we got a whole bunch, and we just had these buckets and we were putting frogs wherever the nearest bucket was. But we were also like writing down what we found. And so I believe we had caught, I want to say an American toad or Fowler's toad. They can be really big, or not really big, but they can be relatively large, like several inches as adults. But when they first hatch in toadlets, they're actually, pretty small, not quite as small as the smallest frog, but the toadlets are, maybe, they're like maybe half an inch. So we had a few little frogs, and then we also caught some bullfrogs. Well, by the time we had gotten back to the classroom to look at everything in the light, because we did this at night, we noticed that there were some frogs missing from the bucket that had the bullfrog. And so we concluded that the bullfrog had started eating the other frogs that were in the bucket. So yeah, they tend to not stay around each other. That way they don't become How much water can a frog take before it drowns? I would say I haven't actually ever heard of a frog drowning because they're aquatic. So just like you wouldn't really think of a fish drowning, right? They have these mechanisms so that they are able to survive, you know, theoretically indefinitely in the water. They leave the water for other reasons, right? To hibernate, things like that. But I don't think that the frog could drown. And actually, there are some species of frogs and salamanders that never leave the lake. Like there's a frog called the African clawed frog, and so it's fully aquatic. It doesn't go on land at all. And some of those like lungless salamanders that you might have mentioned in the trivia, I don't think they leave the water either. If they do, it's only for very short periods of time. How old are frogs evolutionarily? That's a really good question. Frogs are actually pretty old. They date back to over 300 million years ago. Yeah, so they've been here in existence for quite a long time. Okay, Ria's mom wants to know, have I ever seen any snakes in New Jersey while searching for frogs during my fieldwork? Yes, I've seen quite a few frogs, and actually so a lot of snakes. Actually, there have been instances where I was so focused on what I was doing, I didn't realize I was about to step on a snake until it moved to get away from me. So yes, I do see a lot of them, but I've never seen one that's poisonous. In fact, I don't study snakes, so I'm not sure if this is true, but I'm not sure if there are poisonous snakes in New Jersey or not. That would be an interesting thing to look up. I know in Maryland, which is where I'm from, there are poisonous snakes, but I haven't seen any of the same species that I would be avoiding in Maryland when I've been out. Mostly just green snakes, black snakes. Yeah, nothing that would hurt. Okay, Ashley would like to know, do frogs go through rumination like reptiles? And if they do, does the duration, oops, I can't quite read that. Does the duration vary? Okay, so because frogs are cold-blooded, they do kind of have that process of, getting very still. I'm not sure if the same word is used to describe that behavior, but they do have that similar behavior. So frogs are really cool because their physiology, so like the inside of their body has some really cool evolutionary things that have happened. And so they can actually slow their body down very low because they're in these really cold bodies of water or underground when it's freezing. And so when they get into that state, they are, hibernating, right? So they're not really moving. So that's the extreme. But also on just like cold days in the summer, you're also going to notice that they're not going to be moving around a lot either. How long does a frog stay out of the water before it needs to go back? So that is also a very good question. I would say it depends. I would say I don't have an exact number, but I know that it's not for some species, it's not going to be very long. So, you know how we talked about the difference between between the frogs versus the tree frogs versus the toads, right? So the toads and a lot of the tree frogs can actually stay out of the water for quite a while, right? So those spadefoot toads, they spend most of their time out of the water. So we're talking days, weeks, months at a time, right? Because they're able to get some of that moisture out of the soil, actually. But then other frogs, like I said, some are fully aquatic, so they really can't ever leave. But then some of our frogs, like the ones that I study, they're not going to stay out of the water for like weeks on end, right? They spend more of their time hibernating actually in the lake. So I know that wasn't a specific answer, but it really is, species dependent. Shirley wants to know, what was the most unusual frog I've observed or worked with? That's a good question. I would say, I feel like the frogs that I work with are actually like pretty common. So I'm not sure if I have a specific answer with as far as worked with, but one of a student in my department, she has since graduated. She worked with the poison dart frogs, and so she would breed them to raise money for her research. And so before the pandemic, when I had a desk on campus and went in every day to work, I got to share my desk space with her poison dart frogs, which I thought was really fun. I would say the most unusual amphibian, though, that I have worked with was called a hellbender. So that's the common name for the salamander, and it's actually pretty big. So what I caught some for my class, and then I also worked with the Pennsylvania Fish and Wildlife Service because I believe they're endangered in Pennsylvania. I'm not sure if they're endangered everywhere, but they can grow to be several feet long, not 6 feet, but like 2 or 3 feet long. And so people used to kill them because they're afraid of them, and they didn't know that like this creature is not going to harm you. It's good for the environment. It shows that your environment's healthy. It's a very sensitive species. But I thought they were very cool. They are huge, but they are very cool. They have a very specific diet. They pretty much just eat crawfish, which is probably also part of why they are declining, because they don't just eat anything that you put in front of them. What's the best place to find a frog around New Brunswick, and is there a particular time they are most active? So I would say probably most bodies of water, you're going to find frogs. I know on Rutgers campus, there's Passion Puddle, and there are definitely, I believe it's green frogs that are there. There are tree frogs. I think they're the gray tree frogs and not copes that are in Donaldson Park along with green frogs. And then Johnson Park has an insane number of bullfrogs. Especially, so I don't know if you all are familiar with Johnson Park, but there's an area that's kind of like gated off. If you ever like walk over near that area at night, so all of the frogs are mostly active at night. You will hear lots and lots and lots of bullfrogs. And so when I was doing another study, we had permission to be there like after hours. And so we were exploring in that area, and there were just so many bullfrogs at that little pond that it was hard to just walk around without accidentally stepping on a bullfrog. There were just so many of them. So I thought that was pretty crazy. Let's see, where are we on the list of questions? What has gone wrong during field work? That is a good question. I've gotten a lot of flat tires. So that because some off-roading does occur occasionally. But I would say, there's the normal things like, oh, there's a lot of mosquitoes out today, or I ran into a really prickly bush and now I have thorns all over me. But actually the first night that I went out with my undergraduates, there was just a man in the park, and we actually thought that this man was like a corpse. So that was kind of crazy. It turned out they were not. They were just, breaking the law. That's all. But it definitely was an odd start to drive up and see like a person laying on the ground and not move at all when the car lights like shine on his body. So that was always, a very interesting situation. Nothing bad happened or anything like that. And we like called the paramedics, but the guy like ended up leaving before they got there just to like make sure he was okay. But yeah, that was like my first night doing research. So it was kind of a little nerve-wracking. But after that, everything else went pretty much smoothly. And then Lauren wants to know, is it true frogs can survive being frozen? So I would say they can survive freezing temperatures. So that's what I was kind of like alluding to before. So their physiology, like they have the ability to not freeze, even though the temperature might be below freezing. So other animals would eventually freeze, but they're not going to. Do frogs make good pets? I'd say if you are responsible enough to take care of them, sure, why not? They don't require a lot of feeding. You don't have to change the water a lot. You know, they're pretty cute. So I'd say, sure, they could be a great pet. I would say make sure you get them from like a pet store. And if you get one, definitely keep it and don't release it into the wild, especially if it's not a species that's from the United States, because that can have, you know, negative impacts to the environment. Next question, do we have salamanders, newts, and Sicilians in New Jersey? So newts are a type of salamander. I'm not sure if we have newts specifically. I know there are several species of New Jersey, but I don't study them, so I'm not up to date on the exact species, because when I did all of my learning of the species, I was in Pennsylvania, so I know what species are in Pennsylvania. It's very similar, but I'm not, maybe we can look that up really quickly. New Jersey salamanders. Okay, so if you are interested in the different species, the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife actually has like a lot of great information where you can listen to like what they sound like when they call. You can see pictures and, you know, just get general information about where in the state you can find them. Okay, I should have known this. So remember that picture that I showed you earlier? I was like, oh, we found this little salamander on our walk. That's the red spotted newt. So yes, you do have newts in New Jersey, but I believe that is the only one. The rest of them are just, you know, your standard salamanders. So we have like the marbled salamander, we have the blue spotted salamander, the dusky salamander. Some of those, you find those in Pennsylvania too, which makes sense. They're very close to each other. We don't have Sicilians in New Jersey. So Sicilians are mostly just found where it's really warm. They mostly live underground. And yeah, we find them in like Africa and I think a little bit in Asia and maybe also in like Central South America, like Northern South America. That's kind of, you know, around the equator. That's where our Sicilians are mostly found. So unfortunately, we don't have Sicilians in New Jersey. And because of that, because they're only found in the tropics, really, they're really understudied. Like you think about the Atlantic coast leopard frog and how, you know, we're trying to find out information about it, but we're like actively trying to find out information. There's so many species of Sicilians that because they don't live in the areas where a lot of this research is going on, they're actually like data, what we call data poor. Like we really need to get a lot more information about them because we just don't have a lot of scientists who are thinking about them. And then the last question that I see is, when I went to Island Beach State Park, was I looking for amphibians in the marsh or on the sandy beach? That's a good question. So I was looking for them not in the actual like bay. So I was on the bay side. So I wasn't really looking for them in the bay. But before you get to the bay, there's these little pockets of wetlands. And so I was looking for them in that beachy area before you get to the water. So the park has a lot of like pitch pines and other foresty kind of species that are on that island, or in the park, I should say. And so there are frogs that are out there in the park. It turns out that they're southern leopard frogs and not Atlantic coast leopard frogs. So it was a good hypothesis that they were out there, but it just turned out that we were just off ever so slightly. So it was southern leopard frogs. So there are trails that you can walk through, like I said, going towards like the bay side and not the ocean side. And sometimes you'll hear the southern leopard frogs calling out. So are there any other last questions?
No, I think you got all of the questions. So thank you so much, Laina, and thank you to our audience. Those were really great questions, and thank you for joining us today. And actually stay tuned for our next event, which is actually going to be a paint-along event, and it'll be virtual. And so you can join us. That'll be on March 30th, and it'll be starting at 6 p.m. We will have a guided painting session, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So feel free to mark that on your calendars, and please join us on March 30th at 6 p.m. And once again, thank you, Lena, for this talk. It was really interesting, and thank you, everyone, and good night.